is more. Vi en väg mellan grina, ett titum suspect, let die.
Chapter 9. Alistair descended the stairs with determined steps, his mind still absorbed in the conversation he had just had with Keira Fraser. The young woman's revelation had left him facing one of the most difficult decisions since taking leadership of the Camerons, and he needed Ewan's opinion to weigh the risks. He crossed the great hall, heading for the exit with the intention of seeking out his most trusted man, when he noticed a long shadow cutting against the light outside. His expression hardened as he recognized the silhouette approaching the castle. A moment later, Elspeth's figure emerged from the morning mist. Alistair exhaled impatiently, irritated by the untimely visit. "Hello, Alistair," she greeted in a honeyed tone, a purr that churned his insides. If he was already in a foul mood, her presence only worsened it. Elspeth, the woman who had once been his betrothed, the same woman who had betrayed him to leave with a visiting noble and had returned months later, tears in her eyes begging for forgiveness. Alistair had let her stay, for he was not a man to abandon his own to the harshness of the world, but their relationship had died the day she had chosen to leave. She still had that delicate appearance that had deceived him for years. Her golden hair fell in soft curls, her blue eyes feigned a sweetness he no longer believed. Behind that angelic face lurked a calculating spirit, and Alistair, no longer a blind man, kept his guard up whenever she was near. "Elspeth," he greeted indifferently. He tried to step aside and continue on his way, but she blocked him with a carefully crafted smile. "I heard there's an injured young woman in the castle," she murmured, her voice laced with an innocence that fooled no one. "I didn't know we had guests." Alistair crossed his arms, glancing toward the courtyard where his men continued their training. "Elspeth, I stopped explaining who comes and goes from this castle a long time ago. I hope you remember that. And as for the girl, I trust you'll know to keep your distance." "I had no intention of bothering her," she replied, her false sweetness grating on him. "Good," he cut her off, harshly. When he tried to leave, he felt Elspeth's cold fingers settle on his arm. Alistair turned his head, his expression stone-like. "Why are you still angry with me?" she whispered, feigning sadness. He looked at her with hard eyes. "I'm not angry with you. To be angry, I would have to feel something still. And I don't. You're just another member of the clan. Nothing more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do." He shook off her grasp with a curt movement and finally stepped outside. He took a deep breath, relieved to have put distance between them. Elspeth suffocated him, and he was grateful every day that life had taken her away from his side. He had been too blind to see that all she ever sought was to improve her standing, while avoiding any real work. With his mind still unsettled, he strode toward the courtyard, where the warriors halted their training at the sight of him. His gaze swept over the group until it landed on Ewan. "Come with me," he ordered firmly. "Training is over. Return to your duties." Ewan nodded and sheathed his sword at his belt. He knew Alistair well, and could tell something was bothering him. He guessed the encounter with the mysterious young woman hadn't gone as expected.
"What's wrong?" he asked as they crossed the palisade and walked away from the castle.
Alistair needed space to think clearly, away from the noise of the servants and warriors. "The girl attacked me when I entered the room," he said with clear irritation. Ewan raised an eyebrow before letting out a laugh. "Are we talking about the same young woman? The one with a wounded shoulder, weak from fever?" Alistair clicked his tongue, annoyed by his disbelief.
"She doesn't seem so weak."
"Trust me. She thought we had kidnapped her." Ewan let a few seconds pass before speaking, mulling over that revelation. "She's Keira Fraser. She told me her castle was attacked. So it's true. She's a fugitive. She says she didn't abandon her clan.
That she was forced to flee to seek help."
Ewan considered it for a moment and nodded.
"That makes sense.
If the Sutherlands outnumbered them, they knew they would lose and she would be killed. This way they ensured she survived and had a chance to free them. It's a good plan.
That's exactly what I thought, Alistair said grimly. And what did you tell her about our help? That I would think about it. That she had to wait.
She kept insisting we let her go. Ewan smirked, amused. So she's being held. At least until she loses the urge to hit me again. His friend burst into laughter.
Well, if you already know she's a rebel, then you know exactly what she's going to try, don't you?
Alistair let out an exasperated sigh. Damn it. Escape. Chapter 10. Time passed slowly inside that room. Hours had gone by since Keira had woken up, and in a desperate attempt to defend herself, tried to strike Laird Cameron. Since then no one had spoken to her again. She was completely alone, the bandage they had placed on her now discarded on the floor beside the bed. Slowly, despite the pain, she had forced her arm to move. She discovered that the wound had mostly closed during the days she had been unconscious, though the tension she felt when trying to lift it confirmed she still wouldn't be able to wield a sword as she had hoped. She didn't care. She would find a way. With her gaze fixed on the courtyard through the window, she tried to map out an escape route. She didn't know the castle, but from her position she could see the houses beyond the walls. If she managed to reach the outer wall unnoticed, she could blend in among the buildings and from there flee into the forest. The real challenge was escaping without her horse, which was undoubtedly in the stables within the courtyard. She couldn't afford to waste more time. If Laird Cameron wasn't willing to help her, and instead intended to keep her there, she would do whatever it took to return to her people. Even if it cost her life. The arrival of a maid with her food interrupted her thoughts. She hadn't eaten in days, and though anxiety clenched her stomach, weakness proved stronger and she ended up eating. As she did, her treacherous mind wandered to the Laird of Dunraven. And then she realized something she hadn't considered before. If he had given her his own room, where had he stayed all these nights? Where had he slept? The thought of this place belonging to him made his presence linger in the air. She observed the furniture, the sparse decorations befitting a warrior, the bed where he had rested so many nights. Her mind unwillingly pictured him there. Naked. Muscles carved in the moonlight, the slow breaths of a sleeping man. She buried her face in her hands, trying to banish those images her body in an act of rebellion seemed to crave. Stay away from me. She suddenly shouted, jumping to her feet. The door had opened, and for an instant she feared it was him. But no. The maid stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, stepping back when their gazes met. Keira shut her eyes, mortified. She had screamed at the ghost of a man who wasn't even there. I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else, she excused herself, forcing her voice to remain calm. The young woman hesitated for a moment. I just came to collect the tray, my lady. Keira nodded and smiled kindly, stepping aside so she could do so. Once the maid left, she was alone once more. She took a deep breath, pushing those thoughts away and focusing on what truly mattered. Escape. She scanned the room for something to threaten the maid with when she returned. Her eyes landed on the ceramic basin. If she broke it, she could use a sharp fragment. Carefully she wrapped it in a sheet and let it fall to the ground. The sound was minimal, but when she pulled the fabric away, she found exactly what she needed. She took the largest piece and hid it under the pillow. Now all she had to do was wait. Alistair Cameron rode through the forest, putting distance between himself, the castle, and the weight of the responsibilities that pressed down on his shoulders.
But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept returning to her.
The young woman who had burst into his home covered in blood, who had tried to attack him despite her injuries, who had spoken to him with a courage few dared to show. He smiled at the memory of the fire in her eyes when she had tried to strike him with the basin. She was unlike any woman he had ever met. And for the first time in a long while, Alistair wished he weren't the Laird of Dunraven. He wished he were just a man. A man who could allow himself to follow the impulse to punish those defiant lips with a kiss, before taking her into his arms and dragging her to his bed. But his honor and duty outweighed any forbidden desire. Even if his body, every time he pictured her, seemed more than willing to betray him. Chapter 11. Keira's escape plan. Night fell softly over the Highlands, painting the sky a deep shade of blue and casting long shadows between the trees. Alistair Cameron had ridden aimlessly, fleeing from himself and the thoughts that, no matter how hard he tried to banish, returned with the persistence of an echo in the mountains. He pulled his horse to a stop in a forest clearing, letting the animal graze freely as he stepped away, rubbing his forehead in frustration. His other hand clenched around the hilt of his sword, as if the cold hardness of the metal could restore the control that kept slipping through his fingers. "Damn girl," he muttered, his voice tinged with anger. Since Keira Fraser had stormed into his life, his peace had crumbled. For years he had built walls around his heart, shielding himself from the pain that had once torn him apart with Elspeth's betrayal. But Keira, she was different. Her mere presence seemed capable of shaking the foundations of his will. Her ethereal beauty hadn't gone unnoticed by his men, and the comments he had overheard about her had ignited something in him that he had no desire to examine. He had nearly drawn his sword more than once, especially when the conversation had turned to how she might be in bed. He had restrained his fury, but he hadn't missed Ewan's knowing look, sharp and all too observant. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and Alistair lifted his gaze to the sky where the full moon illuminated his path back to the castle. But he wasn't ready to return just yet. He needed a plan, not just to deal with the woman who was driving him mad, but also to understand why the Sutherlands had chosen that precise moment to attack Fraser's castle. Keira gazed out the window of her room. The darkness stretched slowly across the land, signaling that her dinner would arrive soon. She had spent the day trying to force the door open without success. It was locked, barring any attempt at escape. But that didn't worry her. She knew that at some point the servant would return, and she would seize the opportunity. She readied herself. Gripping the broken shard of ceramic, she held it firmly in her hand. She had no desire to hurt anyone, but she would do whatever was necessary to get out of there. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed shortly by the sound of the bolt sliding free. Keira felt her pulse quicken. She forced herself to take a deep breath. There was no room for nerves. The door opened, and she recognized the same maid who had brought her food earlier that day. The woman barely spared her a glance, still wary after the previous outburst, and set the tray on the table. She had no time to react. Keira pounced like a wildcat, covering her mouth with one hand while pressing the sharp edge of the ceramic against her throat with the other. The maid's eyes went wide with terror. "I won't hurt you," Keira whispered, "but I need you to help me get out of here." The young woman struggled briefly, but Keira increased the pressure of the shard against her skin. "If you try to call for your laird or any of his warriors, you will die. Do you understand?" The maid nodded frantically, fear shining in her gaze. "I need to know where my clothes and weapons are," Keira demanded. Slowly she removed the hand covering the girl's mouth to let her speak. "Your clothes are by the kitchens, in a room where we keep clean garments until they're needed," the maid stammered. "But your shirt was torn, and the laird ordered it to be burned. There are other garments there you could use though. And I think your weapons are there too, but I'm not sure." Keira nodded. That was enough. "Good. Now you're going to help me get there. I don't know this castle, so I need you to guide me." "Please don't hurt me," the maid pleaded, her voice trembling. "Relax. As long as you don't do anything to alert anyone, I'll let you go as soon as I'm out of the castle. But if you speak..." Keira slid the sharp edge against her skin, just a whisper of a touch, enough to make her shiver. "You'll regret it." The young woman shook her head over and over. Keira tightened her grip on her arm and urged her forward. "Let's go. We don't have all night." Keira pulled the makeshift blade away from the maid's neck, and grabbed her firmly by the arm, pushing her toward the door. Before stepping out, she peeked into the hallway to make sure no one was there. Darkness cloaked everything, the last traces of daylight fading beyond the castle walls. She smirked at her own luck and forced the girl to move, ignoring the dull ache pulsing in her shoulder. With cautious but steady steps, the maid led her toward the stairs. Everything around Keira was unfamiliar, and despite her urgency, she couldn't help but admire the grandeur of the fortress. "I hope we don't run into any other servants," Keira whispered. "Everyone is in the great hall preparing dinner right now." "Only the cook remains in the kitchens, milady," the maid replied in a thin voice. "But you said my clothes are in a room next to the kitchens."
"Yes, but the door leads to the hallway, not directly into the kitchens."
Keira stopped and fixed her with a suspicious gaze.
"You're not trying to deceive me, are you?"
The girl frantically shook her head, fear evident in her wide eyes. "No, I swear I'm telling the truth. The room has 2 doors, one to the hallway and another to the kitchens, but that one is always kept shut so the clothes don't absorb the smell of food." Keira nodded, not entirely convinced, but she had no other choice. If she wanted to get out of there, she had to trust the maid. They resumed their pace, descending the stairs as quickly as their stealth allowed. The hallway felt too empty. In her own castle, at this hour there would be constant movement. Reaching the ground floor, Keira heard muffled voices from the far end of the corridor. She guessed the great hall lay behind that door. Her heart pounded as she quickened her steps. The entrance was open, and at any moment a warrior, or worse, Alistair Cameron himself, could appear. "Where is your laird?" she asked, curious. "I believe he left the castle, but I'm not certain, milady." Keira smiled. It was the perfect time to escape. If Alistair had gone, he had likely taken some of his men with him. If everything went according to plan, she would be beyond these walls much sooner than expected. "It's here, milady," the maid whispered, pointing to a door. Keira cast a quick glance in both directions. Seeing the coast was clear, she pushed the door open and slipped inside. Darkness filled the room, but the older woman moved easily toward the pile of clothes. Keira spotted the gleam of her sword among the garments, and a smile curved her lips. Finally, she could rid herself of that cold, uncomfortable nightgown. She grabbed her clothes in one swift motion and began dressing. "The shirt is a man's and it might be too big for you, but yours was beyond repair," the maid said. Keira nodded. She already knew that. She had torn the right sleeve herself, to improvise a bandage and stop the bleeding from her wounded shoulder. Her clothing was beyond saving, but she didn't care. When she fastened the Fraser brooch over her uninjured shoulder, a sense of self returned to her. It reminded her of who she was, of her purpose. She looked up and found the maid watching her with admiration. A shy smile played on the young woman's lips. "You're an inspiration for those of us who are not like you, milady."
"What's your name?"
Keira asked. "Neve." Keira stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. The shard of pottery she had used to threaten the maid was no longer in her grip, and she smiled warmly. "Neve, anyone, man or woman, can be whatever they wish to be. They just have to believe in themselves." The girl's eyes welled with tears, a deep blush coloring her cheeks.
"Now I need to get out of here," Keira said. "What's the best way?"
"The kitchen door. If you take the main street, the guards might see you." Neve fell silent for a moment, then rummaged through her clothing until she pulled out a hooded cloak, and held it out to Keira.
"This is my cloak, milady."
"Take it. If you wear it, you'll blend in with me, and can leave through the main door without trouble. I always keep my head down when I pass by the men. I'm very shy." Keira smiled. "Thank you, Neve. If your laird or his men accuse you, tell them it was my fault, that I forced you to help me." The young woman nodded, with a smile. They parted in silence, and Keira stepped out cautiously. The night air filled her lungs, its crispness making her feel alive. With the hood covering her face and the cloak's folds concealing her sword, she walked forward with steady steps. She was free. And neither Alistair Cameron nor his men would stop her. Or so she thought. Chapter 12. Dara couldn't sleep. He had spent too many days locked in that place, and the lack of daily training or hunting expeditions left him restless. He knew the rest of the men felt the same. Everyone's spirits had plummeted since Malcolm returned with the news that if Keira didn't appear within a few weeks, the Sutherlands would start executing them one by one. They knew the young woman well, and her unwavering loyalty to the clan, but they were also aware that many of the imprisoned men had begun to doubt her, and whether she intended to return. No one voiced it aloud, but conversations had gradually dwindled to silence. As the days passed, despair had settled into a heavy stillness that made time drag unbearably. By nightfall, Malcolm led him to a secluded corner of the cell, where no one could overhear them. His voice dropped to a whisper.
"I'm starting to think Keira is dead."
Dara nodded grimly. "You just put into words what I've been fearing too." It would have taken them a couple of days to reach Cameron Castle, another day to organize, and 2 more to return. They should have been back by now. Dara frowned. His mind ran through possibilities, but the truth was cruel. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. "The only thing giving me hope is that if she was wounded, maybe she arrived late and can't travel until she heals. Don't you think?" Malcolm considered his words and slowly nodded.
"Hold on to that thought and pray it's true.
Otherwise we're dead." Not far from there, in the office that had once belonged to Keira's father, and that she never had the chance to claim, Lachlan and Ronan were locked in a heated argument. For days they had sent scouts in every direction, hoping to find Keira, alive or dead, collapsed somewhere on the road after succumbing to the wound Finlay had inflicted. Lachlan was on the verge of declaring her dead, and beginning the executions of the Fraser warriors, but Ronan had a different strategy. "Let's wait for the time we gave your trusted man," he insisted, striving to remain calm. "Even if our men don't find her, she might be hiding somewhere until she recovers. I'm certain she'll return to claim what she believes is hers."
"That's foolishness, Ronan," Lachlan spat with contempt.
"Her alone against a Sutherland force? Who says she'll return alone? Keira isn't stupid. From what little I remember of her, she learned the art of war well. Maybe she went in search of allies. Perhaps she has men at the borders." Lachlan frowned, weighing the idea. "If that's the case, we must be on guard. They could be many. And if that damned whore dares to return to this castle, by God, she'll wish she had never been born." Ronan gave a cold smile. "Well, as her heir, you could always hand her the clan's leadership." Lachlan shot him a sidelong glance, his expression hardening. "I have hated that woman and her mother for years. I assure you, I have something far better planned for her. Before I let you kill her, I'll make sure she learns her place. Ailsa took my happiness from me. They tried to take what was rightfully yours and give it to your sister." Ronan nodded slowly. "I'll do the same, Lachlan. I will never let anyone take what belongs to me."
"That's the spirit, son.
"Those bastards will pay for it." Ronan turned toward the window, gazing into the dark night. His eyes swept over the small stretch of land visible, wondering where the young woman he had once, 13 years ago, considered his sister might be. And the moment he faced her again, everything would change. Chapter 13. Keira moved through the trees, distancing herself from the sounds coming from the houses near the castle. Only when the murmurs had completely faded, did she allow herself to exhale a long sigh of relief. Around her, the moon cast a faint glow on the path. She didn't know this forest, but her sense of direction guided her with precision. With no concrete plan, she considered finding a village or a farm where she could get a horse and ride straight to her lands. Her mind wandered relentlessly to her castle, and the warriors who had sworn loyalty to her. Were they still alive? Had they died before surrendering to the Sutherlands? Her heart clenched with anguish, but she had to stay strong. She would not rest until she saw with her own eyes what remained of her home. And when she did, she would demand answers. Something was eluding her, an ancient hatred no one had ever spoken of. What were the Sutherlands hiding? Why this war against the Frasers? A nearby noise pulled her from her thoughts. She froze, straining her ears. Her first instinct was to assume it was a wild animal, but what she saw surprised her. Just a few feet away, a black horse grazed calmly. She frowned, searching for its rider. No one. Only the sound of hooves on the grass. Cautiously, she approached the animal. She could hardly believe her luck. A horse was exactly what she needed. She stopped abruptly when a dry branch snapped under her foot. The animal lifted its head, alert. Keira raised a hand and murmured in a soft voice. "Hello, beautiful. Don't be afraid." The horse watched her intently, as if it recognized her. Keira smiled and ran a hand over its muzzle. The animal lowered its head, accepting the touch. "What are you doing here, all alone?" She stroked it for a moment longer, before taking the reins with determination. "You'll help me get home." She had barely spoken the words when she felt the cold press of a sword against her neck. Her heart stopped. The voice she heard behind her was low and calm, yet filled with restrained fury. "I wouldn't be so sure of that, girl." "Alistair." Her body tensed, unable to move. A shiver ran down her spine. "Did you really think this horse was alone in the forest?" The mockery in his tone sent a jolt through her. Slowly she turned to face him, finding his expression hardened by anger. In the moonlight his eyes gleamed with veiled threats. "I'd love to know how the hell you managed to escape, find your clothes and weapons, get dressed, and leave my castle without a single one of my men seeing you," he murmured, a shadow of admiration flickering in his gaze. "Who helped you?" Keira straightened her back, and met his eyes without hesitation. "No one. You underestimated me from the start. My father trained me well to lead my clan. Escaping your castle wasn't difficult." The sword still rested against her neck, but Keira held her head high and kept her gaze steady on Alistair, showing him she wasn't afraid. He turned his face slightly, the blade never leaving her skin, watching her closely. "When one of my father's prisoners tried to escape, they cut off his hand so he wouldn't do it again," he murmured slowly. Keira raised both hands unfazed. "Which one do you prefer?" she asked boldly. "Go ahead, cut one off. But don't forget one thing, I'll do it again." Alistair smirked, a peculiar gleam in his eyes. Keira, however, paid no mind and kept speaking. "I still haven't forgotten your words. You said I was in your castle as a guest, and yet you locked me up. My father was wrong about you. He never should have told me to seek your help if I was ever in trouble, because you are now my greatest problem. What do you want from me?" Alistair's smirk deepened, his gaze turning intense. "If I told you, your ears might be scandalized, girl." Keira frowned, confused. She searched his eyes for any clue to the true meaning behind his words, and when she found it in his smile, she couldn't help but blush. "I never gave you permission to call me that," she said, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. "I don't recall asking for permission." Keira clenched her fists and jaw, holding back her anger. Alistair was, without a doubt, an adversary worthy of her. If he was skilled with a sword, he was even more dangerous with words. "Fine. Since you caught me trying to leave, I'd appreciate it if you returned my horse. I'll leave your lands and never come back. I give you my word." Alistair let out something like a short laugh. A sly grin curved his lips as he shook his head. "You're in my lands and I decide what, how and when things happen, girl. You came to me for help. You'll have it, without a doubt. But only when I decide." Keira let out a frustrated huff. "My people could be dying while we're standing here wasting time." "I doubt that," the warrior replied indifferently. "And now, girl, we're going back to the castle." He withdrew his sword from her neck and motioned for her to walk. But Keira remained still, holding his gaze. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached for the hilt of her sword and drew it in one swift motion. "If you won't let me go, I have no other choice." Alistair raised an eyebrow and stepped back, surprised by her audacity. How dared she raise her sword against him on his own land, near his castle, with a fresh wound still on her shoulder? "When you arrived, you wielded a sword. Then you tried to attack me in my own chambers, And now you raise it against me again. Let me tell you something, girl. You're the only one who's done this more than once and is still alive to tell the tale. I don't want to hurt you, so let's go back to the castle. Keira shook her head, and without a second thought lunged at him. Alistair, already prepared, blocked her attack effortlessly. A sharp pain shot through her shoulder as their swords clashed, but she didn't stop. She kept attacking, again and again, even as her arm grew heavy and her breath came in ragged gasps. She knew she would lose, so she spun on her heels and bolted toward the warrior's horse. She sheathed her sword just long enough to grab the reins and grip them tightly, ready to mount. But Alistair's firm hands caught her before she could swing herself into the saddle. Keira felt her body being pulled toward the ground, and braced herself for the impact, fearing her wound would reopen. But the fall never came. Instead, she found herself pressed against a solid, warm chest. She turned her head, her eyes widening in surprise as she realized she had landed on Alistair himself, who held her securely by the waist, preventing her escape.
"Let me go," she exclaimed, struggling against him.
But her efforts were futile. Alistair kept her pinned against him, and Keira felt a hot flush creep up her cheeks when a part of him brushed against her hips. She fought harder, twisting quickly to wrench one of his fingers back with fierce determination. Alistair let out a startled sound, a mix of surprise and pain, giving her just enough time to break free. Yet the moment she tried to get up, he grabbed the hilt of her sword, pulling her off balance once again. This time they both tumbled onto the damp grass. Keira scrambled to rise, but Alistair was faster. In an instant he was on top of her, his legs bracketing her hips, pinning her down. She reacted immediately, striking out with her fists, but he caught her hands before they could reach his face. Lifting them above her head, he rendered her completely defenseless. Keira struggled for a few more seconds, before realizing she didn't have the strength to break free. In that moment, she became acutely aware of how close he was. His uneven breath ghosted over her skin, and the weight of his body against hers was overwhelming. She silently thanked the darkness, at least he wouldn't see the deep blush burning her face. Alistair smirked, leaning in slightly. "If you thought you were going to defeat me, girl, you were very mistaken." Keira clenched her teeth.
"And so are you if you think the same.
You should save your strength for your real enemies. The only enemy I see right now is you." He chuckled softly. "Then you're not exactly in the best position against your enemy. Let me go, and I'll prove you wrong. Still worried I'll cut off your hand for trying to escape? Go ahead, do it."
"That's not what I most want to do to you right now, girl."
Keira struggled, but Alistair's hands were like iron shackles, holding her in place with inhuman strength. Keira remained motionless, pride still etched on her face as she asked, "And what are you going to do with me?" Alistair didn't answer with words. The distance between them vanished in an instant, and before Keira could react, she felt the unyielding press of his lips against hers. It was a merciless kiss, born of fire and restrained fury, of a desire that, far from fading with time, had only grown since the first moment he laid eyes on her. Alistair wasn't seeking tenderness or permission. This was another battle, one in which he aimed to overpower her, to silence her defiance with the urgency of his own passion. Keira felt the world sway beneath her. Heat spread through every fiber of her being, as the warrior's tongue invaded her mouth, meeting no resistance. Her mind screamed at her to push him away, to fight back, but her traitorous body refused to obey. Instead, her lips answered with the same intensity, returning the kiss with a passion that left her breathless. She had never experienced anything like this. The memory of Finley's chaste kisses couldn't compare to what she felt in that moment. This wasn't a mere caress, it was an all-consuming fire, a hunger that pushed her to want more. Without thinking, her back arched toward him, and a muffled gasp escaped her throat at the pressure of his body against hers. Then, abruptly, Alistair pulled away, as if snapping out of a dangerous trance. His breathing was ragged, his expression a mixture of surprise and fury. Keira, equally dazed, felt the night's coldness wrap around her in the absence of his touch. She watched as he jumped to his feet and strode away, kicking a rock in frustration. His anger was as evident as her own, though Keira couldn't understand why. He was the one who kissed me, she thought, both indignant and bewildered. She forced herself to stand, but her legs felt unsteady. Clenching her fists, she wanted nothing more than to run as far from him as possible, but something rooted her to the spot. She didn't know if it was confusion or rage, but she couldn't move. Alistair took several deep breaths before turning to her. His expression, now controlled, was back to what it always was, an impenetrable mask. "We're going back to the castle," he said firmly. "And if you value your life, don't try to escape again." Keira frowned but lacked the strength to argue. Without a word, she followed Alistair to the horse. She refused to look at him, afraid of what she might see reflected on his face. She knew that if she did, her resolve might waver. When Alistair mounted first and extended his hand toward her, she hesitated. She didn't want to touch him again. She knew that if her skin brushed against his, that uncontrollable fire would reignite. But she had no choice. With her heart pounding, she accepted his help and climbed onto the horse, positioning herself behind him. She tried to keep her distance, but the horse's movements forced her to cling to his waist. Alistair didn't react, but Keira felt the subtle tensing of his muscles beneath her hands. Every step the horse took was torture. She could feel the heat of his body, the masculine scent that surrounded her, fueling the storm of emotions within. She knew that if she didn't get away soon, she would be trapped in a spiral of desire and madness from which she might never escape. Keira Fraser, the battle between duty and desire. Keira had spent her life suppressing everything that made her human. Fear, sorrow, hope, even love. As the leader of her clan, she had learned that showing emotion was like exposing cracks in her armor, cracks that others could exploit to break her. Vulnerability had no place in a world where strength determined fate. But the heart did not understand strategy or alliances. It could not be ruled like a castle, or defended like a fortress. And though Keira had built walls around herself, the truth was undeniable. There was one battle she could not fight with a sword, the one raging inside her. Suppressing her feelings had protected her for years, but every unspoken emotion was a fire waiting to ignite, a tide held back that, once unleashed, would sweep away everything in its path. And then she was left with the hardest question of all: was it possible to be strong without turning to stone? Could she remain the leader her people needed, without denying herself? Because there was something far more terrifying than her enemies, and it was the abyss of her own heart screaming to be heard. Chapter 14. Keira knew that sleeping that night was an impossible idea. Even though she had refused to return to the same room, Alistair had imposed his will with the firmness of a man who accepted no argument. And she, exhausted, too drained to continue arguing, had relented. When they arrived at the castle, still atop the laird's horse, the men stationed on the walls watched her with a mix of surprise and suspicion. None of them could believe that the young woman had left the castle unnoticed. They all claimed to have mistaken her for the maid, Neve. Keira swore again and again that the cloak she wore had been in the same room where her clothes were kept, and adamantly denied that Neve or anyone else had helped her. "For your sake, I hope that's true," Alistair warned, his gaze like steel. The change in his demeanor was baffling. Moments earlier, before the kiss, he had seemed to enjoy the situation, his arrogance tinged with that infuriating amusement that always exasperated her. Now, however, fury consumed him, as if he wanted to punish her for something she didn't even understand. Before entering the castle, Keira watched as Alistair lingered, exchanging words with some of his men. She remained where she was, standing completely still with her arms crossed, waiting for his return, which did not take long. The moment he reached her side, he grabbed her arm and pulled her inside the fortress. Keira resisted, struggling until she finally broke free once they were out of sight from the others. "I can walk on my own, thank you," she snapped, her pride intact. Alistair didn't reply. However, he allowed her the freedom to walk unaided, though his eyes never left her. Keira felt the weight of his gaze trailing down her back as she climbed the stairs, but she forced herself to hold her head high, her determination unwavering, until they reached the door to her room. "I'd rather sleep somewhere else," she said before he could open the door. "This is the best accommodated room," he replied, leaving no room for argument. Keira wondered again where he had slept during the past few days, and where he would be until she returned home, but she didn't dare ask. A sigh escaped her lips as another doubt crept into her mind. Her nervousness must have been obvious because Alistair raised an eyebrow, silently questioning her. "You're not thinking of escaping again, are you? My men will verify the identity of everyone who enters or leaves," he warned, his tone sharp. Keira shook her head immediately. "I only want to know if I'll be locked in again, or if I'll be free to leave whenever I wish." Alistair considered her words for a few seconds before answering. "You can leave whenever you want, as long as you give me your word that you won't try to flee again." "You have it," she assured without hesitation. "I already told you I will help your clan, but I will do it my way," he added firmly. Keira sighed but in the end nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Alistair said nothing more. With one last serious glance, he turned on his heels and walked away down the corridor, leaving her completely alone. But Keira couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, cursing the lack of rest and the restlessness gnawing at her from within. She had shed the damp clothes she had returned in, and with no nightgown available, she had decided to sleep naked, wrapped in the blankets. Yet the warmth of the fabric did nothing to dispel the fire still coursing through her skin. She couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. The touch of Alistair's lips on hers had ignited a fire within her unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was nothing like Finley's chaste kisses, the ones that had never stirred more than a distant tenderness in her. No. Alistair had kissed her fiercely, with unrestrained passion, as if he wanted to devour her, to bend her to a desire she hadn't even known she possessed. And the worst part was that she had responded in kind.
"For God's sake," she muttered, burying her face in the pillow.
"Forget it, Keira." She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to focus on her people, on her mission. She had secured the help she needed. That was what mattered. That was what she had to think about. And little by little, with the faces of her clan drifting through her mind, Keira slipped into a restless sleep just as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. From his study, Alistair watched as the rising sun painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. He hadn't slept since leaving Keira in her room. Instead of going to his chambers, he had chosen to stay in his refuge, surrounded by documents and maps he couldn't bring himself to analyze. His mind was elsewhere, lost in another moment, in another person. From the window he could see the vast stretch of forest, the same one where hours ago he had thought he'd seen a ghost among the shadows. When he had first spotted her, cloaked in that dark fabric, the moonlight casting a glow over her fiery red hair, his mind had betrayed him. For a fleeting second, he had believed she was an apparition. A spirit of the woods, a mythical creature sent to tempt him. And then when her face was fully revealed, his heart had pounded violently against his ribs. Keira. His thoughts refused to let go of her. Her defiant gaze, her untamed fierceness. No. He couldn't allow this. He reminded himself bitterly that he had sworn never to fall for another woman again. He had learned that lesson with Elspeth. And though he had sought comfort in other arms over the years, he had come to realize they only left him feeling emptier. Perhaps that was why his body had reacted so fiercely to Keira. But he had to put an end to this. He couldn't afford any weakness. "Damn it," he swore, slamming his fist against the desk before pacing the room in barely contained frustration. He had to get rid of that reckless woman before she burrowed even deeper under his skin. Chapter 15. No matter how hard he tried to push her from his mind, the image of Keira returned with relentless force. Alistair scowled, cursing under his breath as he paced his study. He couldn't afford weakness, least of all for a woman he barely knew. He forced himself to remember that he still didn't know if he could trust her, that there were too many unanswered questions surrounding her sudden arrival in Dunraven. If he was going to help her, he had to be certain her cause was just. With that thought anchoring him, he welcomed the arrival of a new day. Keira heard her name from somewhere far away, as if it drifted toward her from the depths of a dream. Her muscles ached as she tried to move, her entire body feeling as though it had been trampled by a stampede. Fatigue held her captive in a fog between sleep and wakefulness, until the insistent voice called her name again, this time clearer. Forcing her eyes open, she blinked several times until her vision adjusted to the morning light. Neve stood by the bed, a look of quiet sympathy on her face. "When I walked in and saw you still here, I felt sorry for you," she said with a faint smile. Keira returned the smile, albeit wearily, and sat up, instinctively pulling the sheet around herself as she remembered her nakedness. She waited for Neve to finish tidying the room before moving. "If you'd like, I can help you dress," the maid offered kindly.
"That won't be necessary, but thank you," Keira replied with genuine gratitude.
Neve nodded and turned to leave, but before her hand reached the door handle, she hesitated and looked back at Keira with a serious expression. "I told Alistair that you found the cloak, and that I had no idea you were planning to escape," she warned. "If he asks, stick to that story." Keira smirked and nodded. "Thank you, Neve."
"The laird is expecting you in his study," the woman added.
"He said you should come at once." "All right. I'll be there soon." As the door closed behind Neve, Keira let the sheet fall and rose swiftly. If Alistair was summoning her, perhaps it meant he had devised a plan to reclaim Caer. The mere thought of seeing her people again, of taking back her home, ignited a flicker of hope in her chest. She dressed quickly, sliding into her clothes with practiced ease. There were no brushes in the room, so she ran her fingers through her hair, untangling the worst of the knots without bothering too much about her appearance. The only thing that mattered was that she would finally begin planning how to save her people. After splashing cool water on her face from the basin Neve had left, she stepped out of the room with determined strides, making her way to the laird's study. As Keira descended the stairs, she realized that Neve hadn't told her where Alistair's office was. She bit her lip, hesitating, and decided to head to the kitchens to ask someone for directions. However, as she stepped past the open front door, her attention was drawn to a warrior who had just arrived. She vaguely recognized him from the night before, when she had seen him alongside Alistair in the field. Until now, she hadn't come across him again. The man studied her closely, and upon noticing her he approached with steady steps. Keira, unsure of his intentions, instinctively took a step back. Her reaction drew a laugh from the warrior, who raised his hands in a gesture of peace.
"I'm not going to bite you, Fraser," he said with amusement.
"I just wanted to introduce myself." Heat rushed to Keira's face. She scolded herself for showing any sign of weakness and, trying to recover, cleared her throat and stepped forward. "I'm sorry," she replied with a small smile. "I didn't mean to seem ungrateful. I'm Keira Fraser, though I suppose you already knew that." The warrior nodded, his sincere smile easing some of her tension. "Ewan Cameron," he introduced himself. "Friend and trusted man of Alistair." His eyes traveled over her with curiosity.
"Well, I don't remember you looking like this."
Keira frowned.
"What do you mean?"
"The only time I saw you, you were covered in blood and about to faint. I didn't have the chance to admire your beauty, as I do now." The blush returned to her cheeks instantly. Seeing the teasing glint in Ewan's eyes, she averted her gaze in discomfort. "I believe Alistair is expecting us both," she said, steering the conversation away.
"Yes," he agreed.
"I'm glad I found you, I can show you the way." Keira smiled, and as they walked together she glanced at him before adding casually, "I'd prefer if you called me Keira. I don't like the formal and pompous way people usually address one another. I prefer to be treated as an equal, so I'd appreciate it if you spoke to me that way." Ewan chuckled. "Whatever the Lady Fraser wishes," he said, winking at her. Keira shook her head in amusement, but her good mood faded as they neared the office. Her stomach tightened with nerves. She feared Alistair would reprimand her for the kiss the night before, or worse, that Ewan would notice something between them. She clenched her fists in an attempt to steady herself. Upon reaching the door, Ewan paused and studied her with curiosity. If you're nervous about speaking with Alistair, let me tell you something before we go in. He doesn't bite either. He brought a finger to his lips and whispered, but don't let anyone know I said that. I don't want to be the first one he actually bites. Keira smiled, feeling slightly more at ease. She stepped closer to the door and let Ewan knock. A moment later, Alistair's deep voice summoned them inside. Alistair stood by the window, gazing outside in quiet contemplation. At the sound of their footsteps, he turned toward them, his expression unreadable. I see you've already introduced yourselves, he remarked, letting the statement hang in the air. Ewan smirked mischievously. Of course. And if I'd known our guest was this extraordinarily beautiful, I would have come to visit while she was recovering. Keira blinked, surprised by his audacity, but before she could respond, Alistair clenched his jaw. His fists tightened so hard that his knuckles turned white. Ewan, amused by his reaction, shrugged with feigned innocence before clearing his throat and breaking the tension in the room.
Why did you call us here, my friend?
Aside from trying to kill me with your stare. Alistair sank into his seat, interlacing his fingers on the table before looking at them gravely. I don't know if you've heard, but the Sutherlands have put a price on your head. Keira frowned, surprised. The coldness in Alistair's voice contrasted sharply with the closeness they had shared the night before. She refused to let it affect her and focused on his words. A price on her? Why the hell were the Sutherlands so determined to find her? When Malcolm asked me to come for you, they hadn't taken the castle yet. I didn't speak to anyone afterward, so I had no idea about this. Can you think of any reason why they would spread such a rumor? If more people know you're here, they might take advantage of it to claim the reward. Keira thought for a moment before shaking her head. She had no clue about her enemy's motives. I don't know what I've done to the Sutherlands, she said in frustration, but before you leave I need to find out. I told you I don't know anything, she replied indignantly. My father never had enemies, and I didn't have time to make any. Dara warned me that if the clan sensed weakness after my father's death, they might attack us. But I never imagined it would happen so quickly. And Finley. Her voice faltered at the mention of someone who had been more than just a friend. Who is he? Alistair asked brusquely, prompting Ewan to look at him with amusement. Keira sighed. Finley arrived at our clan shortly before my father fell ill. He became close to me. We were friends. He always showed loyalty to my father, but on the night of the attack I saw him on the ramparts. He was the one who shot me. So I suppose he was a traitor. Silence fell over the room as Alistair processed her words. You say that man appeared before your father became ill? Alistair murmured, as if piecing together a puzzle.
How did he die?
The healer said he caught a chill in his lungs, which caused his coughing. Ewan and Alistair exchanged a meaningful look. Ewan leaned forward and asked seriously, what if that man poisoned him slowly? Keira felt the blood drain from her face. Her expression turned into a mix of disbelief and anguish.
What could he have had against my father? She asked in a hushed voice.
Alistair regarded her gravely.
I don't know. But let's start from the beginning, Keira.
Did anything strange ever happen in your family? Kira's heart lurched. Something strange. A lump formed in her throat and her eyes welled with tears. She didn't want to cry. She had promised herself long ago that she wouldn't, that she had already shed too many tears, and blaming herself again wouldn't change anything. But if she cried in front of them, she would show a weakness she couldn't afford. Still, both warriors were waiting for an answer. And she would give them one. With a quick gesture, Keira wiped her cheeks and turned to face them. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with determination. 13 years ago, 2 men kidnapped my brother Ronan. He was 10 and I was 9. That day I convinced him to escape through the back gate, the one no one used, and we wandered into the forest. When we decided to return, 2 men emerged from the trees. I tried to defend him, but they struck me and left me there, unconscious, while they took him away. Even though my father asked me many times about the color of their tartans, I couldn't remember. I didn't know the clan's colors back then, I couldn't identify them. Maybe they were Sutherlands. Alistair studied her with a deep frown. Lachlan Sutherland has led that clan for some years now, he explained. Have you ever heard that name? Keira shook her head. I don't know, I'm sorry, she said, running her hands over her face. Amid the darkness, her father's voice echoed in her memory. Unless. Her heart pounded wildly. She lifted her gaze, looking at both warriors with a terrifying realization. If what she was thinking was true, she was facing something far more complex than she could comprehend or explain. Her legs weakened, and she had to steady herself against the window ledge. Speak, girl, Alistair demanded impatiently. Keira swallowed hard before answering. Before he died, my father confessed something to me, something Dara later confirmed. He told me that my brother Ronan was not his son. But when I tried to ask more, his cough overtook him, and he died before telling me who his real father was. My adoptive nanny didn't know anything else either. Ewan glanced at Alistair, who returned the look with equal gravity. It was clear they had both reached the same conclusion. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Ewan asked in a low voice. Alistair nodded slowly before fixing his gaze on Keira. Lachlan Sutherland is old enough to be your father, girl, he said grimly. And if that's the case, he might have been the one who took your brother. A chill ran down Keira's spine. My brother. Maybe he wanted to reclaim his son. The silence became suffocating. Keira closed her eyes for a moment, trying to sort out her thoughts. I remember that man asking me if he was the firstborn, she murmured. So if my mother got pregnant before marrying Callum and not during their marriage, he knew perfectly well that his son was him. Ewan ran a hand through his beard thoughtfully. Then if he really kidnapped your brother, he could have done it to make your mother or Callum suffer, or for some other purpose we don't yet understand. Alistair stood abruptly. A spark of realization flashed in his eyes, as if he had just found a crucial piece of the puzzle. He exchanged a quick glance with Ewan before focusing on Keira again. You'd better start preparing yourself, he said gravely. Your brother could be in your castle right this very moment. It couldn't be true. There had to be some mistake. Though Keira had never lost hope that her brother would one day return, her mind refused to accept the idea that he might be one of those who had attacked the castle. My brother would never join the man who kidnapped him, nor would he attack our castle, she said quietly as if trying to convince herself as well. Alistair walked around the table and approached her. To her surprise, the warrior placed both hands on her shoulders and looked her straight in the eyes. I'm not saying your brother attacked the castle, but if the Sutherlands took it, he might be with them. He could still be their captive, even after all these years. We don't know. I'm not even certain they were the ones who took him, but everything seems to fit. Lass, Ewan interjected, if your father had had time to tell you the whole truth, everything would be clearer. Right now we only have guesses. I've already told you I need to know everything before attacking, and that's why I asked about what's happened in their clan over the years. Keira nodded, and as if Alistair's hands burned her, stepped back. At that moment, she didn't want anyone's touch or to talk about anything. She just wanted to be alone, and not think about how the Sutherlands had plotted something so cruel for so long. I'm going to send a letter to all the major villages in our clan, Alistair explained. I'll ask their leaders to join us in attacking the Sutherlands at your castle, but it will take several days for them to arrive. We don't have that much time, Keira replied. I know, but it's the only option. We can't march in with the few men we have, and leave the castle unprotected. I need more warriors. Keira sighed in resignation, and moved past Alistair, who watched her with a furrowed brow. If the conversation is over, I'd like to return to my room and be alone. The warrior clenched his fists, tension visible in every inch of his body. Something inside him screamed to pull her into his arms and protect her from everything else. He knew she had just discovered something about her family that she wouldn't have imagined even in her worst nightmares. And though she was trying to remain composed, he hated seeing that sorrow on her face. He wanted to keep seeing the warrior in her, her defiance, her pride, not the defeated air that was now so painfully obvious. Even so, he nodded and let her leave, remaining alone with Ewan. Silence fell between them, and Alistair felt his friend's intense gaze on his back. He had turned toward the window, trying to think clearly, but the weight of being watched made it impossible to focus. "Can I ask what's going on with the lass?" There it was, the question. He had known his friend would ask sooner or later, but he didn't want to face it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the castle walls. "If you think I haven't noticed, then you must believe I don't know you well. But you're wrong. We've been friends since we could barely stand on our own feet, so don't play dumb with me." Alistair let out a long sigh and turned to him. "I saw your expression when I complimented her, and treated her with familiarity," Ewan said with a mischievous look. "But let me inform you that she asked me herself to treat her as an equal. We met at the door, and since we were headed to the same place, I introduced myself. That's all."
"You don't need to explain it to me," Alistair growled through clenched teeth.
"I know, but since you've been paying her more attention than you usually would, I felt the need to mention it. I have no interest in her beyond flattering her and making you angry." Alistair stepped toward him and grabbed him by the front of his tunic. "Be careful with what you say to your laird." "I'm speaking as your friend, not your vassal," Ewan countered with a grin, pushing his hands away and giving him a light punch on the shoulder. Well, well, so the mighty Fraser lass has managed to break through your walls. That's impressive." Alistair grunted, irritated.
"She hasn't managed anything."
Sure. One question. Can I ask why she kept blushing every time she looked at you?" Alistair averted his gaze and made his way toward the door, but Ewan's loud laughter echoed through the room, making him pause. He turned with a dark expression, piercing him with a glare. "Be careful, Ewan. I wouldn't want them to find your body floating in the loch. I'll take my chances." Suppressing his anger at having been found out, Alistair yanked the office door open and slammed it shut behind him. And though his steps carried him toward the exit, Ewan's roaring laughter followed him all the way. Chapter 16. Keira didn't know where she was going either. She needed the cold morning air on her face to forget the conversation for a few minutes. However, her mind kept repeating the same question: what had Lachlan Sutherland done with her brother? "You're going to catch a cold, lass," someone nearby said. Keira looked up and saw a young woman her age. She was beautiful. Her blonde hair waved in the wind, and her deep blue eyes could easily be mistaken for the sky itself. The girl smiled and approached Keira. And although her words seemed innocent, Keira couldn't help but be on guard. It was then that she realized she had left the castle walls behind and walked among the houses. An unsettling silence surrounded her, and when she glanced around, she discovered they were alone. She tried to smile in response to the young woman's friendly gesture, but despite her almost ethereal beauty, something about her sparked distrust. "You left your cloak inside," the young woman said, stopping a meter away. Keira brought her hands to her belt, near the hilt of her sword, and nodded subtly.
"Yes, but it doesn't matter.
I like the cold." The young woman let out a soft laugh.
"You're one of mine?"
"My name is Elspeth, and you are Keira Fraser." Keira tilted her head cautiously. "I see I'm well known." Elspeth shrugged. "Well, whenever the laird receives visitors, word spreads. And you made quite the entrance." Keira shook her head and offered a faint smile.
"That wasn't my intention."
She hesitated for a moment before adding, "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to keep walking." Elspeth's eyes gleamed with intensity. "Oh, so would I. I came out this morning for a walk near the forest, to gather some herbs." Keira hesitated for a moment, but finally relented. She hadn't set out looking for company, but perhaps this conversation would allow her to forget, if only for an instant, the reason she had left the castle. "Is your shoulder better?" Elspeth asked as they walked.
"Yes, sometimes I feel the skin stretching too much and it bothers me, but I'm much better."
"Thank you." Elspeth smiled and Keira walked beside her. The wind grew damper and colder. Both looked up at the sky and saw the clouds gathering, promising rain. Keira welcomed it. She longed for the droplets to fall upon her and surround her. It had always been a balm for her mind. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Elspeth watched her in silence until, after a few seconds, she said, "It must be very hard to know that your castle was attacked and not be there to help." The tone in which she said it made Keira frown. The sweetness disguising it didn't fool her. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of her sword, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She didn't want trouble with the Camerons. Not when she needed their help. With a restrained voice she replied, "Yes, it's hard. But soon I will reclaim what is mine." "I hope so." The emphasis on that word made Keira raise an eyebrow. She wondered what on earth was wrong with this woman. Elspeth had been the one to ask to walk together, yet now she seemed to despise her presence for no apparent reason. "And surely you must miss your husband," Elspeth added. "I'm not married." Elspeth nodded and bent down to cut some herbs with a small knife she pulled from her dress. She placed a handful in her basket, before looking at her again.
"Then you must be betrothed.
Someone like you should marry young." Keira narrowed her eyes, already uncomfortable with the conversation. Still she answered calmly, "I'm not betrothed. I don't need anyone to play my role better than others."
"I don't doubt it, Keira Fraser. But then there's something I don't understand."
Elspeth let the basket drop with a sharp thud. Keira felt her body tense. "If you don't need anyone, why did I see you kissing my man in the forest?" Keira's heart skipped a beat. Had she seen her with Alistair? Because she assumed that's who she meant. Or was she referring to someone else? She had no idea if the laird had a fiancé or a lover, so she decided to divert attention. "I think you're mistaken. I don't know who you're talking about," she replied slowly. Elspeth exhaled with a cruel smile. Her hands remained in the folds of her skirt, and Keira remembered the knife. Would she try to attack her? There was no sweetness left in her eyes, only pure fierce hatred. "Alistair the laird. I saw you kissing him like a common whore, in the middle of the forest." "If that's true, then you also saw that he was the one who kissed me, not the other way around," Keira defended herself. "And he never once told me he had a fiancé." To her surprise, the thought irritated her more than she cared to admit.
"Well, he does.
Alistair and I are getting married, so I suggest you stay out of his way unless you want to end badly. You've already done enough, so leave the castle as soon as possible." Keira stepped closer, locking her gaze with Elspeth's. "I will leave when your laird decides so. You say you're his fiancé, but you're not the leader of the clan. And it seems he doesn't care for you as much as you think, considering the kiss he gave me." Elspeth raised her hand to slap her, but Keira saw it coming, and stopped her with ease. She used her advantage in height and strength to pull her closer, until their faces were mere inches apart. "I know little about your fiancé, but I'm surprised he chose to marry a viper like you. I thought he had better taste." "You damn," Elspeth began furiously. "Miladies." A voice suddenly interrupted, pulling them out of their confrontation. The familiar sound of that voice took them both by surprise. Keira felt Elspeth tremble beneath her grip, and for a brief moment the young woman closed her eyes, fearing she had ruined everything by threatening his fiancé. She let her go, expecting the girl to run to Alistair for protection, but instead Elspeth remained by her side, waiting with the same resignation for the reprimand she knew would come from her enemy. Keira lifted her chin, and met Alistair's gaze unflinchingly. She wasn't about to feel ashamed for threatening Elspeth, she would do it again if necessary. But when she looked into the laird's eyes, she saw something unexpected, surprise and anger, yes, but not directed at her. His fury was aimed at the trembling woman beside her. For a second, Keira glanced at Elspeth out of the corner of her eye, and noticed the fear on her face. "May I ask why you're bothering our guest?" Alistair asked firmly. "Me?" Elspeth placed a hand on her chest with a theatrical gesture, fluttering her lashes with feigned innocence. Keira nearly laughed at the ridiculous performance, if not for the tension in the air. "You saw that she was the one holding me to hurt me."
"That's not true,"
Keira interrupted, her voice burning with indignation. Alistair crossed his arms and looked at Elspeth with skepticism. "I don't doubt that our guest has a fierce temper and a tendency to attack when least expected," he said calmly, "but I doubt you more, Elspeth. You must have said or done something to provoke her." Keira raised an eyebrow, surprised by his unexpected defense. When her eyes met Elspeth's, she saw the frustration and fury in her gaze. The blonde opened her mouth several times before finding the right words. Finally, with a flicker of desperation in her eyes, she blurted out, "We kissed in the forest yesterday." The silence that followed was thick. Keira felt a knot in her stomach, but what surprised her most was Alistair's reaction.
"And what's the problem?" he asked, his voice controlled.
Elspeth looked at him in exasperation.
"That you're mine, not hers."
Alistair took a step toward her, his gaze unreadable. "You're mistaken, Elspeth," he said with an icy tone that made the young woman step back. "Whatever we had ended a long time ago. Don't mention my name in your life again. I'm not coming back to you, so forget me." Tears welled in Elspeth's eyes, but Keira could see they weren't of sadness, they were of pure humiliation and rage. Without another word, she grabbed her basket and ran toward her home, leaving them alone in the middle of the courtyard. Keira slowly turned to Alistair, unsure of what to say. He was watching her intently, making her suddenly feel nervous. "I'm sorry that Elspeth bothered you," the laird said with a sigh. "She still doesn't understand that I won't go back to her." "It's fine," Keira murmured, though deep inside she felt an inexplicable sense of relief. To her surprise, Alistair smiled. It was the first time she had seen him do so in her presence. The hardness in his face seemed to fade for a moment, revealing a different man, one who felt closer, more human. Keira felt something strange in her chest, something that made her relax as well. "I know everything we discussed in my study has been difficult to process," he said after a pause. "To help clear your mind, I'd like to invite you for a walk by the lake." Keira's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected that, but without thinking too much about it, she accepted. She needed to forget the unpleasant encounter with Elspeth, and surprisingly, she felt that Alistair's company might actually help at that moment. She tried not to blush as they began walking together, following the path that led toward the forest. The laird broke the silence. "This afternoon I'll send my best men to the nearby villages," he explained. "I'll ask them to act quickly, and we'll leave as soon as possible." "Thank you. Not just for your help, but also for healing me and giving me shelter." Alistair shrugged and smiled again. Keira frowned, confused. Was this the same man who had treated her with coldness and distrust before? She couldn't help but glance at him from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what had changed in him. But instead of answers, all she found was an unfamiliar sensation that made her tremble slightly. When the lake came into view, Keira stopped, awestruck. It was a place of breathtaking beauty. "It's beautiful," she murmured with a smile. Alistair nodded. "My mother used to bring me here when I was a child. I always come, whenever I need a moment of peace. Besides, it's a good place for a nice swim." Keira turned to him just in time to see him unfasten his belt, and let it fall to the ground. Keira stifled a faint gasp as she noticed Alistair's movement. The surprise forced her to look away toward the lake, feeling a tremor run through her legs while her heart pounded so fiercely it seemed she had just fought a battle. She moistened her lips unconsciously, her mouth dry, and for a moment she considered kneeling down to drink from the lake, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. Beside her, the sound of fabric sliding over the warrior's skin seemed far too unsettling, and for a few seconds, she thought it was all a joke, a clumsy attempt to ease the tension between them. However, when she dared to look at him again, almost fearfully, she found that Alistair had removed his shirt and let it fall onto the grass. Keira cleared her throat, a slow heat creeping up her body. The sight of the half-naked warrior flustered her, but something within urged her to keep watching. There was an invisible aura about him that pulled her in, as though compelling her to step closer to brush against that skin, weathered by years of war and sun. The fire crackling inside her sank lower, burning through her belly with a desire she'd never felt before. Not even with Finley. She clenched her fists tightly, trying to stop her hands from moving on their own and resting on the warrior's muscular back. But her resolve wavered when she saw Alistair unbuckle the belt of his kilt, letting the garment fall to his feet. Keira swallowed hard, forcing herself to regain control. "I think I'd better go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step back just as the last piece of clothing slid from the warrior's body and onto the grass. Despite turning her head quickly, she couldn't avoid a brief glimpse of Alistair's powerful figure in all its glory. With a shaky breath, she averted her gaze, unsure where to rest her eyes. But the warrior's voice found her deep and rough, like steel scraping against a whetstone. "Don't you fancy a swim? The water's not that cold." Keira struggled to think clearly, shaking her head after clearing her throat again. Her mouth felt dry, and she doubted she could string together a coherent sentence after such a sight. "Enjoy your swim. I'm leaving." She turned, intending to retrace the path they had taken, but she'd barely walked a few steps when Alistair's voice stopped her once more. This time, his words pierced her like a poisoned dart.
"Well, I thought the leader of the Frasers wouldn't mind sharing a bath with an ally."
Keira closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath. The provocation was obvious, and when she replied she did so without turning around. "You're naked, for God's sake. And is that a problem? What will you do when you have to camp out in the open with your men? Or is your army made up entirely of women?" Keira clenched her fist so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew Alistair had struck a nerve, but the thought of stepping into the lake with him, both of them bare, overwhelmed her. Without thinking, she spun on her heels, and found him watching her intently. She forced herself to hold his dark gaze, crossing her arms over her chest as if that simple gesture could build a wall between them. "What I do with my men in the future is none of your business." Alistair's lopsided smile almost made her tremble, but she stood her ground. The warrior raised an eyebrow, before turning back to the lake and walking toward the shore. Keira prepared to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. "I thought the leader of the Frasers was a brave, determined warrior, who wouldn't fear a bath with an unarmed man. In the end it seems it's true, you're just a coward who runs away when things don't go her way." Keira froze. No one, absolutely no one, had ever called her a coward. A different kind of heat, a mix of fury and pride, surged through her veins. Her steps were firm and resolute as she approached the spot where Alistair had left his clothes, and let her belt fall to the ground. With swift hands, ignoring the satisfied smile on the warrior's face, she shed her garments and stepped into the water. Alistair watched her, and when Keira reached his side, she lifted her chin defiantly. "Say it to my face, call me a coward again." To her surprise, Alistair smiled and, instead of answering, began to circle her slowly. It was at that moment that the awareness of her own nudity struck her. With trembling hands, she covered her chest, feeling the intensity of the warrior's gaze. The heat within her was so fierce that not even the cold water could extinguish it. "Aren't you going to answer me?" she asked, her voice laced with growing unease. Alistair stopped in front of her and shook his head. His dark eyes traveled over her, burning with a flame Keira couldn't quite understand. "I don't know what kind of spell you've cast on me, Keira Fraser," he said hoarsely, "but I can't get you out of my mind. And if I can't forget you, may God have mercy on my soul." Then he took her face in his hands and kissed her fiercely. Keira clung to his arms to keep from falling, and in that touch both of them were utterly lost. Night had fallen over the valley like a dark cloak speckled with stars, and the whisper of water against the shore echoed in the silence. Keira felt the brush of the wind on her damp skin as she remained in Alistair's arms, her body pressed against the warrior's, their shared warmth defying the night's chill. Alistair kissed her with the intensity of a storm breaking over the sea, his lips moving against hers with a blend of urgency and devotion. Keira responded without hesitation, surrendering to that touch with equal passion. She was no maiden inexperienced in the art of seduction, she knew what she wanted, and more importantly, who she wanted. Alistair's hands explored her silhouette, sliding down her back and moving with the same precision with which he wielded his sword on the battlefield. A soft sigh escaped Keira's lips as she felt the pressure of his fingers on her waist, guiding her toward him with a primal need that echoed within her own chest. "Keira," Alistair murmured against her mouth, his voice rough, heavy with restrained desire. She didn't respond with words. Her hands sought the warrior's shoulders, clinging to them as if she feared the night breeze might tear him away from her. She felt the droplets of water still slipping down his skin, the contrast between the coolness of the lake and the heat radiating from his body. It was as if a flame burned deep within her, one only he could either kindle or extinguish. With a low growl, Alistair pulled her even closer to his chest, his fingers tracing her spine with searing caresses. Keira gasped when his hands moved with the same fierce resolve he'd shown in battle, carrying the unspoken promise of a fire that would not be easily quenched. "You don't know what you do to me, lass," he whispered, his warm breath brushing against the skin of her neck. Keira closed her eyes, letting herself be swept away by the sensation of his touch, by the shiver that rippled through her like a wave rising before it crashes onto the shore.
"Then don't stop," she whispered.
The warrior growled in response, holding her as if she were a treasure only he was meant to protect. The night wrapped around them, a silent witness to a desire that had taken too long to be acknowledged. And there in the darkness beneath the endless sky, Keira knew there was no turning back. Chapter 17. Keira barely had any strength left in her legs. They trembled so violently that she knew she wouldn't be able to stay upright once they reached the shore. She could still feel the pleasure coursing through her skin, an intoxicating sensation that had left her breathless. Alistair held her firmly, guiding her to the riverbank, where their clothes lay scattered over the damp grass. And that was when the shame hit her like a blow. Heat crept up her neck to her cheeks, painting them a deep crimson. Keira buried her face in the curve of Alistair's neck, unable to meet his gaze. Until that moment, since her life had unraveled after her brother's disappearance, she had always followed the path others had laid out for her. She had hidden her desires, smothered her impulses, and suppressed her true nature to please those who expected her to be the perfect daughter and leader of the Frasers. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, she had allowed herself to surrender to what she truly wanted. And though the shame washed over her, she couldn't deny the intensity of what she had felt in Alistair's arms. Everything had changed. Perhaps from now on things between them would take a different course, or maybe they would remain the same. But what Keira knew with absolute certainty was that after what had happened, she couldn't go back to being the person she once was. Something inside her had awakened, and she wasn't sure she could bury it again. As Alistair handed her his tunic to cover herself, her mind was a whirlwind of unrestrained emotions. She couldn't think clearly. The only thing she knew for sure was that in that moment, wrapped in the arms of that man, she felt more alive than ever. Keira's body still trembled, but not solely because of the cold breeze that wrapped around her, it was from the sheer intensity of what they had shared. She could still feel Alistair's heat lingering on her skin, his intoxicating scent, the memory of his hands exploring her with a desperate hunger. She clung to him tightly, refusing to let go, and for a fleeting instant time seemed to stand still. Alistair held her close, his arms a protective shield as he led her toward their clothes, shielding her from the chill of the night. Their eyes met in a silence that spoke more than words ever could, until he finally broke it, his voice low and rough like distant thunder. "God knows I don't want to let you go, lass." Keira felt her chest tighten. The blush on her cheeks deepened, and she lowered her gaze, but Alistair didn't let her pull away. "Don't be ashamed," he murmured. She exhaled softly, her words caught in her throat, a tangled mess of emotions. It's been too long since I allowed myself to follow my impulses. We carry too many burdens on our shoulders to afford such a luxury, he replied, a trace of bitterness in his voice.
But sometimes it's the best thing for everyone.
A gust of wind made her shiver again, and Alistair, sensing her vulnerability, forced himself to release her. He knelt at her feet, picked up his shirt and gently draped it over her back, dressing her slowly without ever breaking eye contact. The space between them was still suffocating. Keira could feel his ragged breath, and the tender way his fingers brushed her arms only intensified the fire simmering inside her. Unable to resist, she rose onto the tips of her toes and kissed him again with renewed hunger. He matched her passion, but he was the first to pull away, resting his forehead against hers. You're a temptation too hard to resist, he whispered against her lips, but we need to go back. Keira nodded silently and stepped away, though every second apart from him felt like a fresh tear in her chest. She couldn't believe how she had acted since they arrived at the lake. She had let herself go, completely, recklessly, and she didn't regret it. Alistair was a man with desires, like any other, but to her he wasn't just any man. For her, he had been the first. And now what? What did this mean to him? She watched him as he dressed, her gaze tracing the way his muscles tensed with each movement. The magnetic pull he radiated was almost hypnotic. When he turned and caught her still watching him, a sly smile curved his lips. Are you trying to tempt me again, Chief Fraser? Keira jolted slightly and hurried to dress, the heat rising once more to her cheeks. I was just thinking, she murmured, her voice distant, as though her mind were miles away. Alistair crossed his arms and studied her intently. Thinking about what? Keira shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Nothing. I was just wondering what happens now. Alistair's brow furrowed, his dark eyes narrowing. What do you mean? She swallowed hard. She hadn't wanted to start this conversation, she dreaded the answer it might bring. But the quiet insistence in his stare forced her to speak. About us, she finally said. I don't know. Maybe you've lived through this countless times with other women, and you're used to it, but I'm not. To her surprise, Alistair took a step back, and picked up his weapons from the ground. He secured them at his belt with a sharp, almost angry motion before speaking again, his voice suddenly cold. What I said before is true. I can't get you out of my head, and I feel a need to protect you that I haven't felt for anyone else, but it has to stay there, he declared firmly as if trying to convince himself. Yes, I've been with other women, but I don't want to marry or commit to anyone, if that's what you're looking for. His words struck Keira like a dagger to the heart. Still, she gathered every ounce of pride she had and lifted her chin. I don't want to marry, she retorted, her voice raw. I was just thinking, not making plans for the future with you. Good, he replied flatly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to return. I have to see if my men have received any replies to the messages I sent. Without another word, Alistair turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her there, alone, stunned, and with a searing ache in her chest. Keira watched him go, feeling humiliated and used. She knew she shouldn't have let herself hope for anything more with him, but the storm of emotions swirling inside her left her shattered. She sank onto a nearby log, hugging her knees to her chest. The cold breeze still blew across the lake, but now it felt like icy blades slicing through her skin. She cursed herself over and over again. She had come to this castle seeking help, not distractions. She should have kept the icy composure that had always defined her, but she'd allowed her emotions to slip through the cracks. And now she was paying the price. Alistair had fled the moment the conversation turned personal, leaving her with the painful certainty that what had happened between them meant nothing to him. With a tight knot in her throat and her vision blurred by unshed tears, Keira clenched her fists. Never again, she vowed. Never again would she allow herself to be this vulnerable. Chapter 18. Something inside Keira told her she shouldn't feel this way. She should remember what had happened as a moment of mutual pleasure, two people swept away by the pull of desire, with nothing more to come from it. Yet, no matter how many times she repeated those words in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart had been shattered into pieces. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. She had to forget what happened, focus on the impending arrival of Alistair's men, and the reclaiming of her castle. Only then could she distance herself from that warrior, and erase his memory. But with every step she took back toward Cameron Castle, it felt as though her heart broke a little more, as if each stride dragged her closer to a living death. Meanwhile, within the stolen halls of the castle, Ronan paced impatiently across the study that had once belonged to his true father. Days had passed without any word of Keira. The men Lachlan had sent to patrol the roads and nearby villages returned empty-handed. Not even the reward they had offered had loosened the tongues of the region's people. The loyalty the Frasers showed toward his sister was impressive, especially considering she had only led them for just over a week. The interrogations of the servants had proven just as fruitless. Even Morag, the woman who had cared for them as children, claimed to know nothing of Keira's whereabouts. Or if she did, she would never speak a word of it. Ronan smirked bitterly. His return to the castle had not been a welcome one. He was no longer a Fraser but a Sutherland, raised as such. Seizing the castle had earned him nothing but the resentment of his former people, but that didn't matter to him. He had a purpose, and all he needed was Keira to fulfill it. A long sigh escaped his lips, as he waited for Lachlan to finish speaking with his men. He had one last idea to find her, and he wasn't willing to waste any more time. Just as his impatience began to boil over, the door swung open without warning. He turned sharply, startled by the lack of decorum, though he quickly remembered that Lachlan had never cared for formalities, especially not when it came to his own study. "Any word on your sister, the usurper?" Lachlan asked, his voice laced with disdain. Ronan shook his head.
"Then why have you summoned me?" "I have an idea to find her. I'm certain she's no longer in these lands. We've already discussed the possibility that she sought refuge with another clan. Perhaps it's time we expanded the search and the reward beyond our borders. I've been thinking, the closest clan is the Camerons. We should send men there and spread the word that we're looking for her. For a few coins, someone will surely tell us what we want to know." Lachlan leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest, mulling over the proposal. After a few moments, he gave a curt nod. "It's a good idea, boy. I'm only trying to help.
I want to find her just as much as you do." Lachlan flashed a crooked smile and stepped closer, his hands gripping Ronan's shoulders firmly. "I've made you a fine warrior. You'll know how to lead this clan with a strong, steady hand, far better than your sister ever could." Ronan smiled and nodded with determination. "I'll send 4 of my men to Cameron Lands. They'll visit the taverns closest to their castle, see if our little fox is hiding there." Lachlan gave a satisfied nod before turning and leaving the room. Ronan's gaze drifted to the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the castle walls. "Where are you?" he murmured to himself. The last image of Keira burned in his mind, the way she had fought fiercely against a young Lachlan and his men before being struck down, collapsing unconscious to the ground. He hadn't seen her since. He wondered how she might have changed in the days she had been on the run. Clenching his fists, Ronan prayed Lachlan's men would find her soon. The sooner they brought her back, the sooner they could put an end to all of this, once and for all. Chapter 19. Meanwhile, at Cameron Castle, Keira could feel the tension between her and Alistair growing thicker by the day. Since they had given themselves to each other by the lake, the warrior had been avoiding her. She knew he had sent letters to his allies, but instead of telling her himself, he had tasked Ewan with delivering the news. Keira noticed the young man's curious glances, though he was too discreet to ask any questions. Tired of the distance Alistair insisted on keeping, she decided to confront him. That morning, instead of having breakfast in her chambers, she took extra care with her appearance and made her way down to the Great Hall. She wouldn't let their relationship hang in this unbearable uncertainty. The castle's corridors were quiet, dimly lit by the flickering torches still burning along the stone walls. With every step, Keira could feel the eyes of the servants on her, perhaps surprised to see her out of her room so early, but she didn't falter. She walked with the resolve of someone who had made a choice, and refused to turn back. When she reached the hall, Alistair was nowhere to be seen. The warm air from the blazing hearth barely softened the morning chill clinging to the room. Keira pressed her lips into a thin line and sighed, her patience slipping. He couldn't keep avoiding her. She needed to see him, to speak to him, to demand answers. Her gaze swept across the hall, searching for anyone who might know where he was, but most of the warriors seemed preoccupied with their own affairs. Frustrated, she decided to return to her chamber and gather herself. If she was going to face him, she would do so with dignity. When she entered her room, she found Nyström waiting, a selection of dresses carefully laid out on the bed. "I'm glad to see they fit you well, milady," the older woman said, smoothing the skirt of one gown with a practiced hand. Keira smiled softly. Nyström had become one of the few people in the castle with whom she felt she could be herself. "How many times must I ask you to call me by my name?" she teased, a spark of warmth in her voice. The maid shrugged with feigned innocence. "As many times as you wish, milady." Keira rolled her eyes and shook her head. She approached the table where Nyström had left a bowl of fresh water, and wet her hands before smoothing her hair with her fingers. "Do you know where Alistair is?" she asked bluntly. The maid hesitated for a moment before answering.
"Yes, he went downstairs a while ago."
"He's in his study." Kira's heart skipped a beat. She straightened up and with one last glance at her reflection in the small bronze mirror, left the room. She wasn't going to wait another minute. She thanked the maid for the information, and walked at a steady pace toward the indicated room. As she got closer, a knot of nerves tightened in her stomach. She was ready to confront him, to tell him what she thought, but now that the moment was near, she feared he would reject her. However, she couldn't bear this feeling of guilt and uncertainty any longer. She wouldn't let the day end without saying what needed to be said. When she reached the door, she knocked, and waited for Alistair to allow her in. The moment she heard his voice from the other side, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Alistair turned his head toward her, and the moment she saw his expression, Keira felt the air leave her lungs. His face was marked with disdain, as if her presence were an inconvenience. Was this the same man who, just 2 days ago, had confessed his feelings to her? "My men haven't arrived yet," he said without preamble, "but they won't take long. Maybe 2 days, 3 at most." Keira closed the door without acknowledging his words and faced him. Her pride surfaced, making her lift her chin higher than necessary as she looked at him with determination.
"I'm not here to talk about your men."
"Oh. I have more pressing matters to attend to." Keira scoffed and averted her gaze before locking eyes with him again. She stepped forward until barely a meter separated them. "I want to know what I said or did to make you avoid me like this."
"Nothing," he replied curtly.
Keira frowned, waiting for him to say something else, but when the silence stretched on, she scoffed again. "Is that all? After what we shared at the lake, that's your only response?" Alistair narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms.
"I told you what I think."
"I swore never to marry, or have any kind of relationship with a woman. I never spoke of marriage or commitments. Only of what could happen between us. And I never imagined it would turn into this indifference you've sunk into. Every time you see me, you avoid me as if you were afraid of catching some disease. I'm still the same person you spoke those words to." "They were just that, words," he shot back instantly. Keira stared at him. His eyes were hard cold, and she felt a sharp pain tighten in her chest. Like she was nothing, Alistair had used her and then cast her aside. No dagger or sword could wound her more than that indifference, and the icy look on his face. She swallowed hard to keep back the tears burning in her throat, but a few escaped to her eyes, surprising Alistair, though he didn't react. "Maybe I should have gone to the Munros or the Rosses for help." Alistair's frown deepened.
"What are you saying?"
"Perhaps they would have the courage you lack." Alistair took a step toward her, but Keira held her ground.
What the hell are you implying? That you don't have the courage to face your own words, so you run. Watch what you say, girl.
I've never run from anything. Alistair was mere inches from her now, but Keira met his gaze with defiance.
That's not what you've shown me.
You spoke, you used me, and then you ran. Sorry, but that's not my idea of bravery. Alistair's hands clamped onto her arms, pulling her to him until their faces were just a breath apart. Their mingled breaths stirred between them, and she felt the same dizzying rush as at the lake. His dark eyes searched hers with intensity, trying to decipher her, but Keira simply smiled with a hint of challenge and lifted her chin even higher. This time, she would win the battle. He had called her a coward that day at the lake, and now those words turned against him. No one calls me a coward and lives to tell about it, Alistair growled. Then congratulate me, she retorted with a smile. I'll be the first. She wrenched herself free with a sharp movement, and took a step back without breaking eye contact. Alistair Cameron, you're a coward who would rather run than accept his own feelings, she accused. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'll leave you alone to digest my words. She turned and walked toward the door. And if you'd like, I can bring you some water to help them go down easier, she added mockingly. She opened the door and stepped out, but before she got far she heard a frustrated roar escape Alistair's throat. She smiled in satisfaction. Yes, she had won. She was Keira Fraser, a warrior. Nothing and no one could break her, not even love. Chapter 20. The air in the tavern was thick with the scent of beer smoke, and the salty tang of damp wool. Candles flickered atop the tables, casting dancing shadows against the soot-darkened walls. Elspeth sat at the bar, arms crossed in a relaxed manner, idly observing the few patrons still lingering in the small inn at this late hour. A man's voice pulled her from her thoughts. We're looking for someone in these lands, girl. Elspeth looked up, surprised that anyone would try to involve her in something that had nothing to do with her.
And what does that have to do with me? She asked irritably.
The man let out a mocking laugh. Don't worry, it's not you we're after, he said with barely concealed disdain. Elspeth pressed her lips together, about to deliver a sharp retort, but the second man, speaking in a calmer tone, cut in. We're not Camerons, as you can tell from our clothes, he explained, gesturing to the colors of his clan on his trousers. We're Sutherlands, and we're looking for a young woman about your age. Her name is Keira Fraser. Do you know her? Elspeth arched a brow, incredulous at her own luck. Could they possibly be speaking of the same Keira? There couldn't be many women by that name, who were being hunted. She knew the redhead had fled her castle after the attack, and the invaders had been the Sutherlands. Inside, her heart leapt with excitement at the opportunity before her.
Yes, I know her, she admitted, suppressing the triumphant smile threatening to curl her lips.
The two men exchanged glances. One smirked with satisfaction, while the other studied her with suspicion. Are you certain? We don't want any deception, woman. Elspeth smiled and stepped toward them with slow, deliberate movements, swaying her hips provocatively. Her eyes locked onto the one who had spoken, hard and unwavering. You mean the Fraser chieftain? The one who was wounded in the shoulder, and fled her castle under attack? The very one, the man confirmed, his expression serious. I know her. I've seen her, and I know where she is.
Speak, woman, they ordered in unison.
Elspeth's smile widened, her eyes narrowing. I'll speak, but I want something in return. We can offer money, the man said impatiently. I don't want money. I want that bitch to suffer and die slowly. One of them stepped forward, stopping just a breath away from her face. Then he grinned and gave a slight nod.
It seems Fraser has made good friends around here.
She chose the wrong enemy, Elspeth replied, letting the venom of her hatred seep into her words. She stuck her nose where it didn't belong, and now I want to see her pay. I'm sure our laird's plans will please you, but first we need to catch her. Will you help us with that? The other Sutherland asked. Of course, she declared, her satisfaction almost feral.
Where is she?
At Cameron Castle, protected by the laird, she answered, savoring every word as she imagined Keira's downfall. The men exchanged glances, nodding with determination.
Now we need to find a way to lure her out and bring her to us.
Elspeth grabbed him by the shirt, trailing her fingers slowly down his chest with calculated ease. She savored the moment, relishing the chance to change her fate. Relax. I'll make it easy.
Leave it to me.
Chapter 21. Throughout the entire day, Keira hadn't crossed paths with Alistair again. She was certain that after the battle she had won against him, he must have been furious with her, and in a way she was grateful not to see him until his anger had subsided. She knew she had gone too far by calling him a coward, but she had been right. The look in his eyes and the words he had spoken to her that day by the lake had little to do with his current coldness. She had thought about it, and reached the conclusion that Alistair hadn't considered the consequences of his words in that moment, and when he did so with a cooler head afterward, he had felt ashamed for revealing more than he had ever intended. She hadn't either. She had never allowed herself to be carried away by such deep feelings, let alone given herself to a man she had known for only a few days, but who for some reason felt as if he had always been a part of her life. Keira had the distinct feeling that she and Alistair were more alike than they realized, and though her pride wouldn't allow her to admit it, she had also fallen at his feet. That was what unsettled and infuriated her the most. Not being able to clearly express what she felt, coupled with Alistair's rejection, had pushed her to challenge him. And she didn't regret calling him a coward. She would do it again and again until he repeated those beautiful words to her. However, she couldn't stop worrying about her clan. The thought that due to her recklessness, Alistair might refuse to help her lingered in her mind. She had left him roaring with rage, and at the time it had seemed amusing. But now, as night fell, she wasn't so sure it had been the right thing to do. She was exhausted. The constant back and forth of her thoughts drained her more than any training session with her warriors.
But she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, so she left the castle to enjoy the crisp night air and clear her mind.
With steady steps, she climbed the stairs to the battlements, moving away from the guard who watched her with evident surprise. When he took a step toward her, likely intending to ask her to leave, Keira shot him a fierce look, and the man quickly thought better of it. No one was going to dare give her orders. Since her arrival, she had been met with respect and even a hint of admiration, but she was well aware that many doubted her ability to lead her people. And though she herself had questioned her place after the Sutherland attack, she was determined to prove to the other clans that she was a warrior, one they would do well not to cross. She perched atop one of the merlins, trying to relish the silence and the darkness. Taking a deep breath, she filled her lungs with the crisp, clean air before exhaling slowly. After several breaths, she finally began to relax, and a smile crossed her lips as she recalled a conversation from earlier that afternoon. She had been speaking with Ewan. Before nightfall she had run into him, and the warrior had given her a knowing look before striding toward her with purpose. Keira stopped, watching him with a slight smile, certain of what he was about to ask. "Can I ask what the hell you did to Alistair to put him in such a foul mood?" Keira couldn't help but laugh and shook her head. "I just told him what I thought, nothing more." Ewan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About how I find him cowardly in a certain way." The warrior's eyes widened in surprise. "You called him a coward? Do you want him to kill us all during training?" he exclaimed incredulously.
"Rob has a cut on his side, Fergus has another on his temple.
No one has dared get in his way because he's been handing out blows to everyone. My jaw still hurts." "I'm sorry, Ewan," Keira said, still smiling. "I only meant to make him react, not enrage him." "Aha. And can I ask what led you to call him that? Because I see the same anger in your face as in his, though you hide it better." Keira sighed. "It's personal, Ewan." The warrior eyed her with suspicion, and slowly nodded. "So you've fallen for each other, but you're both too proud to admit it?"
"No, it's not that. You're not fooling me, girl.
I know Alistair, and I've never seen him this furious, not even when Elspeth left him. And you? Well, I don't know you as well, but I can tell your anger comes from feeling the same way while he chooses to deny it. Fine. It's true, but don't you dare tell anyone. Ewan raised his hands in surrender and shook his head. God save me from getting between you two. I'd like to stay alive. Now, on the battlements, Keira finally faced the question she had been trying to avoid. Was she in love with Alistair, or was this just infatuation? She had never been one to indulge in whims, but she had also never been in love before. She told herself she needed to return home as soon as possible, and focus on her clan. If Alistair truly didn't want her by his side, she had to move on. She stood up and started walking back. But before she reached the entrance, a hooded figure emerged from the shadows. As she moved, the moonlight caught her blonde hair. Elspeth. Keira stopped, meeting her gaze. For an instant, the other woman's expression wavered with fear before she quickly masked it. The same resentment from days ago returned to her eyes. Keira stood firm, holding her stare as she watched Elspeth walk away. Chapter 22. The night wrapped Dunraven Castle in a cloak of shadows and icy wind. Keira walked along the cobbled path with steady steps, though a storm of thoughts raged inside her. She would have liked to say a few things to Elspeth to settle matters once and for all, but she wasn't in the mood for more confrontations. So when the blonde disappeared into the darkness toward her home, Keira resumed her path. The warmth of the castle greeted her like a silent, comforting embrace. She inhaled deeply, grateful. She loved the cold night air, but her hands were numb. Rubbing them vigorously, she climbed the stairs. Halfway to her chamber, Elspeth's image resurfaced in her mind. What was she doing at the castle, at that hour? Only the servants moved through the halls at night, and Keira assumed Alistair was either in his room or his study by now. For a few seconds, she hesitated. She could go speak to him, apologize if necessary. The victory had tasted sweet, but she feared his reaction. Yet the doubt vanished quickly. She had asserted herself, and she had to stand by it. Shaking her head, she continued to her chamber door. As she opened it, the glow of the fire illuminated her face. She smiled faintly and stepped inside. Unfastening her belt, she let it drop beside the bed. Moving slowly, she longed to collapse onto the mattress and stretch out her aching body. She pulled back the canopy curtains but froze in place. Frowning, she noticed a letter resting on her pillow. She sat at the edge of the bed, carefully picking it up. Her name was written in elegant, precise handwriting that took her by surprise. Slowly, as if fearing it might be some kind of trap, she opened it. Upon seeing the Cameron seal, her expression hardened. Only the laird had access to it. Her pulse quickened. Alistair had written it. For a moment, she hoped to find in the letter the same words he had once spoken to her by the lake. But as she read the first lines, her eyes widened in disbelief. Keira Fraser, Chief of Clan Fraser. I am writing this letter to formally request that you leave my castle and my lands immediately. After careful consideration, I have decided that I will not risk my men in a losing battle. This afternoon, I sent another message to inform them of my refusal, so do not expect reinforcements. From now on, you will have to fight alone to reclaim your lands, and I expect you to do so far from here to avoid conflict with the Sutherlands. I ask that you leave my castle as soon as you read this letter, and that you do not seek me out for explanations. This is a decision I have considered for 2 days, and I am now certain of it. Leave, and for the good of both clans, do not return. Do not ask for my help nor trouble my men. I wish you luck against the Sutherlands. You will need it. Alistair Cameron. Keira felt a knot in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she reread the first words, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A scorching heat spread through her chest and a tear rolled down her cheek. She wanted to go find him, to demand that he say all of this to her face. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He was a coward. She mocked herself for ever doubting his loyalty. He had played with her. He had mocked her pain, her desperation. While her clan suffered, she had wasted her time at Dunraven. She never should have listened to Malcolm and Dara when they urged her to flee in search of help. She should have stayed in Caerlaverock and fought to the end. She clenched the letter in her fist, the paper crumpling under her grip. Alistair Cameron was no better than the Sutherlands. She ran a hand over her face, wiping away her tears with a sharp motion. "Damn you, Alistair Cameron," she muttered through clenched teeth. "Don't worry, you'll never see me again." She threw the letter onto the bed and sprang to her feet. Snatching the belt from the floor, she fastened it around her hips with determination. She wouldn't wait for dawn. She wouldn't spend another night in that castle. She would leave immediately, even if it meant sleeping under the open sky. With resolute steps, she strode toward the door. Her mind was made up. She would go to the stables, saddle her horse, and leave Dunraven. She didn't need Alistair. She didn't need anyone. She would save her clan on her own or die trying.